Welcome back. Well, with NATO's mission having changed, debate about NATO's role in Afghanistan and the Balkans continues, with some asking, is the organization still relevant? And if so, what is its mission statement? NATO was set up during the Cold War to protect Western member countries from the Soviet Union and the countries under its influence. But since the Soviet Union's demise in 1991, NATO's mission has undergone radical change. Today, NATO commands almost 2 million troops and has 26 nations counted as members. And the organization is currently deployed for fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan and conducting peacekeeping duties in Kosovo. Well, joining us again are our guests in Paris, Joret Kaminga. He's the Director of Policy Research at the Senlis Council. In Berlin, Jan Techau of the German Council for Foreign Relations. And in Moscow, Dmitry Babic. He's a political analyst from Russia Profile magazine. Mr. Babic, looking at Kosovo, we spoke about Afghanistan in the first half. Kosovo is set to declare independence very soon. Will this create another divisive dilemma amongst NATO members?
I don't think Kosovo will create a problem amongst NATO members, although I'm sure that a lot of people in such NATO member countries as Greece or Bulgaria may not be very happy about Kosovo becoming independent. I expect people in other countries, in Russia, probably even in Croatia, be not very happy about Kosovo's independence. So I'm sure that there will be more opposition to Kosovo's independence from outside NATO than from inside NATO.
Mr. Techau, NATO already has thousands of peacekeeping troops in Kosovo. How will they deal with independence and some sort of Serbian hostility, possible Russian hostility as well to the declaration of independence?
Well, I firmly believe that there won't be any real hostilities on behalf of the Russians, and most certainly also not on behalf of the Serbs. There's too much at stake for Serbia itself. I think the decision on Kosovo independence has long been made. We're talking about formalities, about keeping face at the moment. The Serbs for years and years and years on end have made it very, very clear that they are only interested in the territory of Kosovo, but not in the least bit in the people of Kosovo. And that is not a very legitimate claim over a certain piece of a country. And therefore, I think there's a political development here which is coming to a conclusion now that has been going on for a while. The NATO forces, I think, will be there on standby. I think what's even more important than that is that we're now talking about a huge EU mission in the region, and I think the EU position on all this is probably more important than the NATO position on this. And I think both organizations will decide to go on like this. There will not be a real official position of the organization itself because you can't bring all of the countries into one line. But on a bilateral basis, a lot of countries, if not most of the member countries of both organizations, will acknowledge independence, and there is not much anybody can do about this.
Mr. Kaminga, NATO was founded to counterbalance the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. Is there an argument for maybe another organization which is Eastern-based to counterbalance NATO?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, the future of NATO is at stake. I would agree with the previous speaker that it's more at stake in Afghanistan than over Kosovo. Obviously, Serbia's future also lies with the European Union and the European partners. But definitely, there's more and more discussion about the future of NATO having to struggle with its past, with its tradition, with helping out countries that are from the same kind of societies, the same kind of Western values. Now we see that, for example, with the Afghanistan mission, that suddenly they have to adapt to a situation in South Asia where you have different cultures, different ethnic groups, struggling with their own problems on the ground.
But what about, sorry to interrupt you, what about others adapting to NATO? Sorry to interrupt you, what about others adapting to NATO? Because some would say this is already happening with agreements like the Shanghai Cooperation Council, which has Russian, Chinese, Pakistani, Indian and Central European influences, some sort of counterbalance to NATO. Do you think that that trend is happening?
Well, not really. They might be willing to be more powerful and to come up with some kind of alternative to NATO, but at the moment you see that politically they have very little clout. So at the moment there is no alternative for NATO when it comes to certain kind of conflicts within the Atlantic, let's say the traditional Atlantic area. But indeed, when it comes to Afghanistan and other countries in that region of the world, we might be looking in the future at organizations involving China, for example, involving Pakistan, India, that could know more about the region, that could know more about the people living in those areas and better be equipped to deal with certain situations.
Mr. Babic, Ukraine wants to join NATO. Vladimir Putin has signaled that he's not very happy about this. He said he'd direct missiles towards Ukraine. Once again, Russia will feel that NATO is at its doorstep and stepping on its toes. Do you think that there's the prospect of conflict here?
Well, I would make one small correction. Putin said that he would point missiles at Ukraine if Ukraine deploys NATO bases on its territory. Theoretically, if Ukraine joins NATO, it will be possible, because right now the Ukrainian constitution prohibits permanent deployment of foreign bases on its territory. Russian Black Sea Fleet is based on Ukrainian territory temporarily. We know that it will be withdrawn. But if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, the Atlantic Charter will be more important than Ukrainian constitution. And if there are NATO bases on Ukrainian territory, of course Russia will feel nervous. Because even if NATO is not hostile to Russia today, no one knows what will happen tomorrow. Who could think in 1989 that 10 years later, in 1999, NATO bombers will bomb Yugoslavia? I think there wouldn't be a single person in Yugoslavia in 1989 who would view such a possibility. A bombing of Russia or of Ukraine looked a lot more likely in 1989 than a bombing of Serbia, but still it happened.
All right, well,
so
the future is full of surprises. Sorry to interrupt you.
Russia has to think about future.
Can I interrupt you, because I want to bring in Jan Techau. There's only a minute left, or less than a minute. Mr. Techau, are you optimistic about the future of NATO?
Yes, I'm pretty optimistic about the future of NATO. I don't think that there's a finality to NATO, just as there's no finality to any other organization. It will grow, it has to adapt to new challenges. And as long as there are countries out there, like in Eastern Europe, the ones that we were just talking about, and in Southeastern Europe, who have a very strong interest in joining NATO, who are standing there knocking on the door, desperately wanting to come in, as long as this is happening, I don't see why NATO is superfluous. And I think the obstacles that we see are surmountable, definitely. It's going to be difficult, but it's possible.
Gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure hearing your thoughts in Paris, Berlin and Moscow. Thank you very much for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye for now.